At our family Thanksgiving dinner, my dad pointed to the porch and commanded, "Your seat's out there." My sister laughed. "Even the cat made the table before you." I surveyed the room and found every plate had a name. Everyone was jubilant, except me. So I picked up my gift from under the tree, turned to her, and proclaimed, "Make sure you read what's under your plate." I walked out without looking back and heard yelling before I even reached the exit gate. I, 32M, never thought I'd be spending Thanksgiving evening in my truck, listening to my family's muffled shouting through the thin walls of my childhood home. But here I was, engine running, watching the porch light flicker against the November darkness while chaos erupted behind me. The whole mess started 3 months ago when Dad had his heart attack. Nothing major, the doctors said, but it scared him enough to start talking about his will and estate planning. That's when my sister decided to become the perfect daughter overnight. She'd been living in California for the past decade, barely calling except for birthdays and holidays. But suddenly she was driving down every weekend, bringing Dad his favorite cookies, organizing his medications, and playing the devoted caretaker. I should have seen it coming. I'd been the one taking care of Dad since Mom passed 5 years ago. Every doctor's appointment, every grocery run, every late-night emergency call when he felt chest pains that turned out to be heartburn. My sister had her fancy marketing job and her perfect life 3 states away, while I'd stayed local, working construction and checking on Dad daily. But apparently, none of that mattered today. I'd arrived at Dad's house this morning with my contribution to dinner, a homemade apple pie that took me 3 attempts to get right, and found the place transformed. My sister had decorated everything with expensive-looking fall centerpieces and matching napkins. The dining room table was set with Mom's good china that hadn't been used since her funeral, and each place setting had a small card with someone's name written in my sister's careful handwriting. That's when I noticed it. 6 place settings. 6 names. Dad, my sister, her husband, their 2 kids, and my uncle who'd driven up from Phoenix. But no card for me. When I asked Dad about it, he just shrugged and said my sister had handled all the arrangements. She was in the kitchen, laughing with her husband about something while she stirred the gravy. I walked over and asked her where I was supposed to sit. She looked at me with that same condescending smile I remembered from childhood and told me she'd made the seating chart based on family. Real family, she emphasized. People who actually cared about Dad and showed up when it mattered. I reminded her that I'd been showing up for 5 years straight, but she just rolled her eyes and said showing up wasn't the same as providing. She gestured toward the expensive groceries covering the counter, the professional catering dishes keeping everything warm, and the bottle of wine that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. That's when Dad walked into the kitchen and delivered the crushing blow. He told me that if I wanted to eat, my seat was out on the porch. He said it matter-of-factly, like he was discussing the weather. My sister actually laughed and said that even the cat had made it to the table before me. She pointed to Dad's old tabby cat, who was indeed sitting in a chair with a small plate of turkey scraps in front of him. I stood there for a moment, looking around the dining room at the family that had apparently voted me off the island. Dad was already sitting down, adjusting his napkin. My uncle looked uncomfortable, but didn't say anything. My sister's husband was cutting turkey for the kids, pretending not to notice the tension. And my sister was beaming like she'd just won some sort of victory. But I had a victory of my own waiting under the Christmas tree. See, Dad had asked me to pick up his gift for my sister a few weeks ago when his back was acting up. He'd wanted to get her something special, something that showed how much he appreciated her recent attention. So I'd gone to the jewelry store and picked up the diamond necklace he'd described, the one that cost $3,000. The one he'd charged to his credit card without thinking twice. What Dad didn't know was that I'd also been managing his finances for the past 2 years. He'd given me power of attorney after Mom died, when he realized he couldn't keep track of all the bills and medical expenses. I'd been balancing his checkbook, paying his mortgage, and monitoring his spending to make sure he didn't get taken advantage of by scammers or pushy salespeople. And what my sister didn't know was that I'd been documenting everything. Every weekend she'd missed, every holiday she'd skipped, every time I'd had to rush Dad to the emergency room while she was posting vacation photos on social media. I'd kept records of it all, including the increasingly desperate voicemails Dad had left her over the years that she'd never returned. But most importantly, she didn't know about the envelope I'd taped under her dinner plate 3 hours ago, when she'd been outside supervising her husband's attempt to fix Dad's broken fence post. I walked over to the Christmas tree and picked up the elegantly wrapped box with her name on it. My sister was already gloating, probably thinking I was about to make some pathetic gesture of reconciliation. She asked me what I was doing, and I told her I was giving her dad's gift early. Then I looked directly at her and said she should make sure to read what was under her plate. Not on it, I emphasized. Under it. I walked toward the front door while she frowned and lifted her plate. I heard her sharp intake of breath just as I reached the hallway. By the time I got to the porch, she was yelling my name, her voice cracking with panic. The envelope contained photocopies of everything. 5 years of medical records showing every appointment I'd taken Dad to. Bank statements showing every bill I'd paid. Phone records showing every unreturned call. But most damaging of all, it contained a copy of Dad's original will from before his heart attack, the one that left everything to both of us equally, along with a copy of the revised will he'd signed just last week. My sister had been busy during those weekend visits, apparently. She'd convinced Dad that since she was the only one who really cared about his future, she should inherit the house, the savings account, and the small life insurance policy. I was to receive a token amount, enough to avoid a legal challenge, but not enough to matter. What she hadn't counted on was me having copies of everything, including the recordings I'd made of our conversations where she'd explicitly stated her plans to cut me out of the inheritance. Pennsylvania is a one-party consent state, which meant I didn't need her permission to record our chats. I sat in my truck for about 10 minutes, listening to the escalating argument inside. My sister was demanding to know how I'd gotten the documents. Dad was yelling about privacy and betrayal. My uncle was trying to mediate. The kids were crying. Finally, Dad came storming out onto the porch, still wearing his Thanksgiving apron. He marched over to my truck and demanded to know what I thought I was doing. I told him I was protecting myself from a family that had decided I wasn't worth a seat at the table. He tried to explain that my sister had just been trying to help him get organized, that she'd been working so hard to take care of him. I asked him if he remembered who'd been taking care of him for the past 5 years. I asked him if he remembered the night he'd fallen in the bathroom, and I'd spent 6 hours in the emergency room with him while my sister was at some corporate retreat in Vegas. Dad's face went red, and he told me I was being dramatic. He said families go through difficult times, and I needed to be more understanding of my sister's situation. She had a demanding job, he said. She had kids to worry about. She couldn't just drop everything and come running every time he had a problem. I told him he was right. She couldn't drop everything and come running. But I could, and I had, for 5 years. Then I told him that if he wanted to leave everything to his perfect daughter, that was his choice. But I wasn't going to sit quietly while she rewrote history and pretended I'd never existed. My sister appeared on the porch, her face streaked with tears and mascara. She was holding the envelope, and she looked like she'd seen a ghost. She asked me what I wanted, what it would take for me to not cause any trouble. I told her I didn't want anything from her. I just wanted her to know that I knew. I wanted her to understand that her little performance hadn't fooled everyone. And I wanted her to remember that the next time she decided to exclude someone from the family table, she should make sure they didn't have access to the family secrets. Dad demanded to know if I was threatening them. I told him I wasn't threatening anyone. I was just evening the playing field. Update 1. 3 days later, Dad called me. His voice was different, quieter, more uncertain. He asked if I could come over to talk. When I arrived, my sister's rental car was gone, and the house looked like it had been hit by a tornado. The expensive decorations were packed away, and the dining room table was back to its usual cluttered state. Dad was sitting in his recliner, looking older than I'd ever seen him. He told me my sister had driven back to California the morning after Thanksgiving. She'd been upset about the whole situation, he said, and felt like I'd ambushed her. I asked him if he'd read through the documents in the envelope. He nodded slowly and admitted he'd forgotten about a lot of the things I'd documented. He said he'd been so focused on my sister's recent visits that he'd somehow minimized everything I'd been doing. Then he asked me if I'd really been recording their conversations. I told him I had, and I explained why. I said that after years of being taken for granted, I'd started to worry that my contributions to the family would be erased entirely. I told him about the times my sister had called me directly, asking me to handle various crises because she couldn't get away from work, and then later telling Dad she'd been the one to solve the problems. Dad was quiet for a long time. Finally, he asked me what I wanted him to do about the will. I told him that wasn't my decision to make. I said I'd never asked him to leave me anything in the first place. I'd just been trying to help him because I loved him. But I also told him that if he wanted to have a relationship with me going forward, it needed to be based on honesty. I was tired of being the invisible son, the one who handled all the unglamorous responsibilities while my sister got credit for the occasional grand gesture. Dad nodded and said he understood. Then he did something that surprised me. He picked up the phone and called my sister. I could hear her voice through the speaker, defensive and sharp. Dad told her that he was calling to let her know he was going to change his will back to the original version, splitting everything equally between us. My sister's voice got louder, and she started listing all the things she'd done for him recently. Dad listened for a while, then interrupted her. He told her that he appreciated her recent efforts, but he'd been thinking about the past 5 years, and he realized he'd been unfair to me. She asked him if I was there, if I was forcing him to make this call. Dad looked at me and said no, I wasn't forcing him to do anything. He said he was making the call because it was the right thing to do. After he hung up, Dad and I sat in silence for a while. Then he asked me if I wanted to help him make a proper Thanksgiving dinner, just the two of us. I told him I'd like that, but only if he promised to let me sit at the table this time. He actually laughed at that, which was the first time I'd heard him laugh in weeks. Update 2. It's been 2 months since Thanksgiving, and things have settled into a new normal. Dad and I have dinner together twice a week, and I still help him with his appointments and errands. But now he acknowledges what I do, and he started insisting on paying me for my time, even though I've told him it's not necessary. My sister calls him every Sunday, but the conversations are shorter now and more honest. She stopped pretending to be the perfect daughter, and Dad has stopped pretending that her occasional visits make up for years of absence. Last week, she called me directly. It was awkward at first. We hadn't spoken since Thanksgiving. She told me she'd been thinking about what happened, and she wanted to apologize. Not for wanting Dad to be taken care of, she said, but for the way she'd gone about it. I told her that I understood she'd been trying to help, but that she'd made me feel like I didn't matter. I explained that I'd never wanted to compete with her for Dad's attention. I'd just wanted to be acknowledged for the things I'd been doing. She was quiet for a while. Then she admitted that she'd felt guilty about not being around more. She said that when Dad had his heart attack, she'd panicked and tried to overcompensate by taking control of everything. She'd convinced herself that managing his finances and making decisions about his care was more important than the day-to-day support I'd been providing. I told her that I didn't need her to feel guilty, but I did need her to be honest about what had really been happening. I said that if she wanted to be more involved in Dad's life, I'd welcome the help, but not if it meant erasing my contributions. She agreed, and we've been working on rebuilding our relationship. She's planning to visit for Easter, and she's already asked me to help her plan something that includes both of us. Dad's health has been stable, and he seems happier now that the family drama has died down. He started talking about taking a trip to see my sister in California this summer, and he's asked me to come with him. I've been thinking about that Thanksgiving dinner a lot lately. About how quickly things can change when people feel like they're not being valued. About how family dynamics can shift when fear and guilt get mixed up with love and obligation. I don't regret what I did. My sister needed to understand that her actions had consequences, and Dad needed to confront the reality of how he'd been treating me. But I do regret that it took such a dramatic confrontation to get everyone to be honest with each other. The envelope under the plate wasn't really about revenge, though I suppose it looked that way. It was about making sure that the truth didn't get buried under my sister's revisionist history. It was about refusing to be erased from my own family's story. And in the end, that's what mattered most. Not the inheritance, not the will, not even the apology. Just the simple acknowledgement that I'd been there all along, doing what needed to be done, even when no one was watching. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply make sure people see what they've been choosing to ignore. Sometimes that's all it takes to change everything.